ask for a show of hands. How many of you had a teacher in high school who made a really big impression on you, someone you wanted to be like? All right, awesome. The vast majority, not quite all of you, but almost. I also had a teacher like that, Mr. Buxton. He was my English teacher and my wrestling coach. And when I showed up as a dorky freshman, Mr. Buxton spoke to me like he would to any adult. If he approved of something I'd done or disapproved of something I'd done, I knew it right away because he didn't have that mask that some teachers have when they're talking to kids. If I asked him a question on Wednesday, he'd come back to me on Friday saying that he'd thought about it, and he really had. He made you feel like he wanted you on his team. Looking back on it now, I think it was Mr. Buxton who made me want to be a teacher. So 12 years ago, I began teaching history at Wings Academy, a public high school in the Bronx. Now, the school where I was teaching did not have the same resources as the school I'd gone to. Where I went to high school, we went on field trips into the woods, we had graphing calculators for trigonometry, we had the supplies to do just about any art project. But when I started teaching in the Bronx, I saw firsthand that all schools are not created equal. My colleagues and I would spend a lot of our own money on copy paper and pencils, and we often couldn't get the resources our students needed or do the projects that would excite them about learning. We'd talk in the teacher's lunchroom about books we wanted our students to read, and a field trip we wanted to take them on, and a microscope we needed to bring science to life. I figured there were people out there who'd love to help if they could see where their money was going. So I used a pencil and paper, and I drew out a website where public school teachers could post classroom project requests, and donors could choose a project that they wanted to support. For $2,000, a programmer who had recently arrived from Poland was willing to build that site. It was super rudimentary. The back end was one page that you'd have to scroll down for like 15 minutes to get to a teacher or a project that you were looking for. To process a donation, I had one of those black boxes that you see at the grocery store where you punch in the credit card number and the dollar amount and send it over a telephone line. It was like PayPal, but by hand. And it was a really good thing that my students were helping me out. So then I had to get my colleagues to try out the site and post the first projects. So I asked my mom to make the dessert that you see behind me. Roasted pears with orange rind and apricot glaze, they taste something awesome. I put the dessert in the teacher's lunchroom on the table, and before my colleagues could scarf it down, I said, "Hold up, there's a toll. If you eat one of these pears, you have to go to this newly created website, DonorsChoose.org, and ask for whatever it is you most want for your students. Propose the project that you've always wanted to do with them." It took only 11 minutes for my colleagues to scarf down the pears, and they proceeded to post the first projects. The health teacher, she was the first to eat the dessert, and she wanted to do a pregnancy prevention project for which she needed baby think it over dolls, which are life-size, life-weight dolls that cry at 3 in the morning and need to be fed and show a teenager what it would be like if they had a kid. The English teacher, he wanted to get his students ready for the SAT, so he requested SAT review books. The art teacher, she wanted to create a 20-foot by 30-foot quilt with each student doing a square of it, and for that she needed fabric and thread and needles. My aunt, who's a nurse, and my uncle, who's a minister, they funded the first project. But I didn't know any more donors to fund the other 10 projects, so I had to fund them myself, which I could afford to do because I was still living at home with my parents. I donated anonymously, so my colleagues mistakenly thought that the website actually worked, and that there were all these donors on the site just waiting to fulfill teachers' classroom dreams. That false rumor spread across the Bronx, and teachers started posting hundreds of projects that needed a whole lot more money than what I could afford. I didn't know how I was going to get them funded. But my students came to the rescue. They could see the potential of this experiment to change their lives at school. And I think they felt a little bad for me. So for 3 months, they volunteered every day after school to spread word to potential donors. They addressed and compiled 2,000 letters by hand to people all over the country, telling them about this website where somebody with $10 could be a classroom hero. We had to get the cheapest postal rate, so we sorted the mail ourselves, and each desk in my classroom represented a different postal region. We carted the sorted letters to the post office and crossed our fingers. It worked. My students' letter writing campaign generated $30,000 to projects on our site. We were on our way. Then 9/11 happened. And teachers at the schools beside Ground Zero started posting projects on our site for recovering from the attacks on the World Trade Center. There were hundreds of these projects. There was a math teacher who requested calculators for her students because their original set was sealed at the disaster site, and their classroom had been relocated to a basement. There was a high school teacher who wanted to bring in an Afghani artist to do after-school workshops so students could learn about Afghanistan. There was a first grade teacher who wrote about her students being saved by a particular group of firemen, and those students wanted to do a musical performance for the firemen who had saved them in front of the ladder company, and for that they needed musical instruments. With these hundreds of projects related to 9/11, I thought that local media would jump on the story. This was right when people yearned for a way to participate in the recovery effort. The Red Cross had almost too many blood donations than they knew what to do with. And here was this direct way for people to help. But no local reporters would give me the time of day. I must have called 100 of them with no success. So I figured I better aim higher. The Holy Grail was the New York Times. They had a new reporter covering nonprofits and philanthropy. Her name was Stephanie Strom. And I figured that if we could get Stephanie Strom in the New York Times to do a story about us, we would have a shot at big-time impact. So I put together a package of materials, and I mailed them to Stephanie. I didn't hear back, so a couple of weeks later, I called her up. She was nice, but she said that we were awfully small potatoes. If she was ever doing a roundup of online charities, she would try to mention us, but we were not newsworthy. Damn. Then I found a directory of the top people at Newsweek, and I called the senior editor, Jonathan Alter, because his last name began with A, and he showed up at the top of the list. I called him during my lunch hour, and his assistant must have been out to lunch because he picked up the phone. And I said, hey, I'm a teacher up in the Bronx. I started this nonprofit with my students. Do you want to hear about it? And he said, sure. We talked for 45 minutes, and that night, he wrote a column for the Newsweek website saying that he thought that DonorsChoose.org, this experiment growing out of a Bronx classroom, would one day change philanthropy. So I called up Stephanie Strom all excited, and I said, hey, Newsweek saw us as newsworthy, at least for their website, so won't you give us a second look? Well, then she dashed my hopes. She said, I'm not going to touch your story with a 10-foot pole now that another reporter has covered you. The New York Times does not follow in the footsteps of other publications. I felt like an idiot for having told her that another media outlet had broken the story of our site. So I wrote her an email apologizing for being so dumb. And she could see how bad I felt. She took pity on me. And she wrote back saying, don't worry, you shouldn't feel bad because you didn't have a chance in the first place, because my editors have asked me to focus exclusively on charities responding to 9/11. So there was my last opening. I spent the weekend crafting an email to Stephanie Strom talking about the hundreds of 9/11 projects on our site. And I called her up as well over the weekend. I left her a voicemail so that I would go, so that I wouldn't interrupt her while she was writing on deadline. And I said, this is the last time you're going to hear from me. All I ask is that you read this one last pitch. On Monday, I was back at school teaching, and I checked email in between periods, and she had written back. Stephanie Strom wanted to do an interview for a major feature story in the New York Times. Let me tell you, I was over the moon. My parents raised me to be humble, but it felt like the skies had opened and I had to shout. I forwarded Stephanie's email to my friend and I said, guess who said she wouldn't touch our story with a 10-foot pole and now wants an interview? That's what hustling will get you. I beat my chest. I talked all kinds of trash. I thought I was forwarding Stephanie's email to my friend. I'm getting nervous adrenaline just reliving this story. I'd hit reply. And when I realized, I pulled the cord out of the electrical socket. But it was too late. I sent that trash-talking email to Stephanie Strom, philanthropy reporter for the New York Times. So naturally, I sent her another email apologizing for being so dumb. And to Stephanie's eternal credit, she did not hold it against us. She went on to write a story in the New York Times with the subheadline that DonorsChoose.org might be the future of philanthropy. And we have tried to prove her right. As of today, more than 800,000 people have given over $100 million to projects from half of all the public schools in America. We've delivered, thank you. Thank you. We've delivered books, art supplies, field trips, technology to over 6 million kids from low-income families. And I can tell you, I never, ever dreamed that I would one day be at Chicago Ideas Week sharing numbers like that. And I never imagined that I'd be able to ask each of you to experience what we call citizen philanthropy. If you believe, like we do, that dedicated teachers are unsung heroes, and go to DonorsChoose.org and find a classroom project that matches a passion of yours, an interest of yours. Do a search for the town where you grew up, or for your favorite book as a kid, and see what projects come up as results. You can give as little as $1 to the project that speaks to you, and get the same transparency and accountability and vivid feedback that Bill Gates gets when he's making a $1 million donation. That is the joy of giving. Thank you for your time.